I taught my daughter to paint sunsets every evening for 3 years before learning she was completely colorblind. The art teacher's email arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with a subject line that made my stomach drop. Concerns about iris. Please call ASAP. My daughter was 7 years old and had been painting with me every single evening since she was 4, creating sunset after sunset with a skill that amazed everyone who saw her work. I called Mrs. Kellerman immediately from my office, already defensive before she even answered. "Mr. Cross, thank you for calling back so quickly," she said, her voice carefully neutral in that way teachers use when they're about to deliver bad news. "I wanted to discuss something I noticed during today's art class. Iris completed a color wheel assignment, and I'm concerned she might be having some vision issues." She paused, and I heard papers rustling. She labeled every single color incorrectly, not just mixing up similar shades, but completely wrong identifications. She called red gray, orange brown, yellow light gray, green medium gray. Every color on the wheel was mislabeled as some shade of gray. My first reaction was to defend Iris, to say the teacher must have misunderstood, or that Iris had been joking around, but something about the systematic nature of the errors stopped me. I asked Mrs. Kellerman to email me photos of the assignment, and when they arrived 5 minutes later, I stared at my computer screen feeling like the floor was dissolving beneath my chair. The color wheel was technically perfect, each section painted with smooth gradients and precise boundaries, but every label was wrong in exactly the way the teacher had described. Red labeled as dark gray, orange as medium dark gray, yellow as light gray, and on through the spectrum with Iris confidently identifying colors she clearly couldn't perceive. I immediately thought about our painting sessions, the 3 years of evening rituals where we'd painted hundreds of sunsets together, and suddenly, I was seeing them differently. How many times had I said, "Mix orange and pink for those clouds," and watched Iris confidently select paints while I praised her color choices? How many times had I told her, "That's the perfect shade of purple," without actually checking what color she was using? I left work early and drove home in a daze, calling Iris's pediatrician from the car to explain what the art teacher had noticed. Dr. Setra Patel squeezed us in for an appointment the next morning and referred us to a pediatric ophthalmologist named Dr. Vivian Leeds, who specialized in color vision deficiencies. That evening, I watched Iris during our painting session with new attention, really looking at what she was doing instead of just enjoying our time together. We were painting the sunset visible through our dining room window, and I described it out loud the way I always did. "Look at those beautiful orange and pink clouds," I said, pointing at the sky. "Try mixing some cadmium orange with a touch of titanium white and maybe a hint of quinacridone magenta." Iris nodded seriously and reached for paints, confidently squeezing colors onto her palette. But when I looked closely at what she'd selected, my chest tightened with recognition of what I'd been missing. The orange she'd chosen was actually a brown. The pink was a gray. She was mixing them together with complete confidence, creating a muddy brownish-gray mixture that she then applied to her canvas in smooth, technically perfect brushstrokes. I watched her paint for 20 minutes, describing colors she couldn't see and selecting paints based on some system I didn't understand. And the painting that emerged was compositionally beautiful but chromatically wrong in ways I'd somehow never noticed before. The sky was brown where it should have been orange, gray where it should have been pink, muddy green where it should have been purple. Everything was off, and yet I'd been praising these paintings for 3 years, hanging them all over our house, posting photos online where friends commented about her incredible talent. How had I never seen this? How had I looked at hundreds of sunset paintings and never noticed they were the wrong colors? I felt sick with guilt and confusion, but I forced myself to smile at Iris and tell her how beautiful her painting looked, not wanting to upset her before we knew what was actually wrong. After she went to bed, I pulled out every painting she'd ever created and examined them under different lights throughout the house. In our dining room with its warm evening lighting, they looked almost right. In the kitchen under fluorescent bulbs, they looked wrong. In the bathroom under LED lights, they looked completely wrong. Browns and grays instead of oranges and pinks, muddy greens instead of purples. 3 years of evidence that something was wrong, and I'd been too blind myself to see it. The appointment with Dr. Leeds was scheduled for Friday morning, and I spent Thursday night researching colorblindness instead of sleeping. I learned that most colorblindness was partial, people unable to distinguish between certain colors but still seeing others normally. Red-green colorblindness was the most common, affecting about 8% of men, but less than 1% of women. But there was another condition called achromatopsia, complete colorblindness, where people saw the world entirely in grayscale. It was rare, affecting only 1 in 30,000 people, but it matched what I was seeing in Iris's work. People with achromatopsia learned to associate brightness levels with color names, creating elaborate translation systems that let them function in a color-centric world despite seeing no hue at all. Reading about it felt like someone was describing my daughter, explaining how she could confidently call things by color names while clearly not perceiving what those colors actually looked like. I found forums where colorblind adults discussed their experiences, and one comment stuck with me. "I didn't know I was colorblind until I was 12 because I'd learned to fake it so well. I knew grass was called green and sky was called blue, and I could identify those things by context, even though I was just seeing different shades of gray. It wasn't until I failed a color vision test that anyone realized I'd been translating the whole time. Dr. Leeds' office was designed for children, with bright murals on the walls that now seemed cruelly ironic. She was patient and kind with Iris, explaining each test in simple terms before performing it. The Ishihara plates came first, circles filled with colored dots that formed numbers. People with normal color vision could see the numbers clearly, but people with various types of color blindness saw different numbers or no pattern at all. Iris couldn't identify a single number correctly, seeing only random dots where clear patterns existed. Dr. Leeds' expression grew more serious as the testing continued. She showed Iris a box of colored chips and asked her to arrange them in order from light to dark. Iris organized them in a way that would make perfect sense if they were all shades of gray, but made no sense based on their actual hues and saturations. She put a dark blue next to a dark red, next to a dark green, grouping them by brightness while completely ignoring the color differences. Dr. Leeds pulled out a device called an anomaloscope that tested color matching ability, but Iris couldn't complete the task because she couldn't perceive the color differences the test required. Every assessment pointed toward the same conclusion, but Dr. Leeds wanted to be absolutely certain before making a diagnosis. The final test was an electroretinogram that measured electrical activity in Iris's retina when exposed to different wavelengths of light. They put electrode stickers around Iris's eyes and had her look at flashing lights while a computer recorded her retinal responses. I held her hand during the test because the equipment looked scary even though it didn't hurt, and I could feel her small fingers squeezing mine tighter with each flash. After about 30 minutes, Dr. Leeds removed the electrodes and asked us to wait in her office while she analyzed the results. The 15 minutes we sat there were among the longest of my life. Iris swinging her legs from the big office chair and asking if she'd done well on the tests. Me trying to smile and say she'd done great, while my mind spun through implications I didn't want to face. When Dr. Leeds finally came in, she had printouts of test results that meant nothing to me, but clearly meant everything to her. She sat down across from us and took a breath before speaking, and I knew from her expression that my worst fear was about to be confirmed. "I'm very sorry to tell you this," Dr. Leeds began, looking at me rather than Iris. "The test results show that Iris has achromatopsia, which is complete congenital color blindness. She has no functioning cone cells in her retinas, which means she cannot perceive color at all. She sees the world entirely in shades of gray, black, and white." The words felt surreal, even though I'd suspected them for 2 days. Dr. Leeds continued explaining the genetic causes and the lack of treatment options, but I was barely hearing her because I was thinking about 3 years of painting sessions, hundreds of evenings where I'd been teaching Iris about colors she couldn't see. Every time I'd said, "mix orange and pink," she'd been hearing words that meant nothing to her actual perception. Every time I'd praised her color choices, I'd been praising her ability to fake something she couldn't experience. The paintings covering our walls, the art I'd been so proud of, all of it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding between us. Dr. Leeds was saying something about how impressive it was that Iris had learned to navigate a colorful world so successfully, but I couldn't focus on anything except the crushing guilt of not noticing sooner. I looked at Iris, who was processing the doctor's words with a confused expression that told me she didn't fully understand what was being said. Dr. Leeds pulled out visual aids, showing comparison images of how the world looked with normal color vision versus with achromatopsia. The difference was stark, one image filled with vibrant colors and the other showing the exact same scene in grayscale. "This is what most people see," Dr. Leeds said, pointing at the colorful image. "And this is what you see, Iris. Everything in shades of gray." Iris stared at both images, and I watched her face change as understanding slowly dawned. "You mean everyone else sees it like that?" she asked, pointing at the colorful version. "All the time?" Dr. Leeds nodded gently. "Yes, honey. Most people see colors the way they're shown in that first picture. You see them the way they're shown in the second picture, in grayscale. You've been seeing that way your whole life, but you learned to use color names by listening to what people told you and remembering which gray tones were called which colors." Iris turned to look at me with an expression of betrayal that cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt. "So, when we paint sunsets," she said slowly, "and you say they're orange and pink, I'm not actually seeing orange and pink?" I tried to explain, but my throat was too tight, so I just shook my head while Iris's eyes filled with tears. "All the paintings I made," she whispered, "are they wrong? Are the colors wrong?" I wanted to say no, wanted to tell her they were beautiful regardless, but Dr. Leeds spoke first with clinical honesty. "The colors in your paintings probably don't match what your dad sees when he looks at real sunsets," she said carefully, "because you're selecting colors based on their brightness, not their hue, but that doesn't mean your paintings are bad or wrong. They're just different from what someone with typical color vision would create." Iris wasn't listening anymore. She pulled her hand away from mine and stared at the floor, and I could see her mentally reviewing 3 years of painting sessions and realizing that everything she'd thought she was good at was actually just the elaborate system of memorization and guessing. The drive home was silent, except for occasional sniffles from the back seat, where Iris had curled up as small as possible. When we got to the house, she ran straight to her room and slammed the door, and I stood in the hallway surrounded by her sunset paintings that I could now see were all wrong, browns and grays and muddy greens, instead of the vibrant colors real sunsets contained. That evening at 6:30, when we normally would have started painting, I knocked on Iris's door and asked if she wanted to do our sunset. She didn't answer for a long time, and when she finally spoke, her voice was flat and defeated. "I don't want to paint anymore. There's no point if I can't see what I'm doing. All those paintings I made are wrong and stupid, and I hate them." I tried to tell her they weren't stupid, that they were beautiful in their own way, but she cut me off. "You've been lying to me for 3 years, telling me I was doing a good job when I was using all the wrong colors. Everyone who sees my paintings probably thinks I'm weird or bad at art, and you just never told me." Her accusation hurt because there was truth in it. I had been lying in a sense, praising work without really seeing what she was creating, too caught up in the ritual and the emotional meaning to notice the technical problems. I sat outside her door trying to find words that would help, but everything I thought to say seemed inadequate. Finally, I just told her I loved her and that we'd figure this out together, even though I had no idea how. For the next week, Iris refused to paint. Our evening routine was broken for the first time in 3 years, and the empty canvases in the dining room felt like an accusation every time I walked past them. I watched Iris withdraw into herself the same way she had after her mother died, becoming quiet and isolated, and I felt helpless to stop it. Her art teacher, Mrs. Kellerman, called to ask how the doctor's appointment had gone, and when I explained the diagnosis, she was sympathetic, but also curious. "I've been researching achromatopsia since I sent you that email," she said. "There are actually quite a few successful artists who have the condition. They've developed techniques for working with color despite not being able to perceive it directly. Maybe knowing that would help Iris understand she doesn't have to give up art completely." She sent me links to articles about colorblind artists, and I spent that evening reading about painters and designers who'd created stunning, colorful work despite seeing only in grayscale. One artist named Gregory Fisher had become famous specifically for his landscape paintings that somehow captured the emotional essence of color through careful understanding of value relationships and color theory. I tried showing Iris the articles about colorblind artists, but she wasn't ready to hear it. She was stuck in the grief of realizing she'd been perceiving the world differently without knowing it, that 3 years of what she'd thought was shared experience with me had actually been two people doing completely different things while using the same words. I understood that grief because I was feeling it too, mourning the loss of what I'd thought our painting sessions meant. But I also knew we couldn't stay stuck there forever, so I started forming a plan. If Iris couldn't see colors but had still managed to create reasonably accurate paintings for 3 years, that meant she'd developed some kind of system for translating her grayscale vision into color vocabulary. If I could understand that system, maybe I could help her refine it into something more reliable. I spent hours studying color theory, learning about how every color had a corresponding gray tone at different brightness levels, how value relationships were actually more important than hue in creating depth and dimension. I bought books about painting for the colorblind and tools that photographers use to check gray values, and slowly a new approach to teaching Iris started forming in my mind. 2 weeks after the diagnosis, I knocked on Iris's door with a proposition. "I want to try something different with our painting," I said. "Not the same way we used to do it, but a new way that works better for how you actually see." Iris was skeptical but curious enough to follow me to the dining room where I'd set up a new kind of lesson. Instead of just describing colors and expecting her to know what paints to use, I'd created a reference chart showing common sunset colors with their corresponding gray values. Orange was a medium light gray, pink was a light gray, purple was a medium dark gray, and so on. I'd also bought a set of gray value cards that photographers used, numbered from 1 to 10 representing different levels of brightness. "Here's what we're going to do," I explained. "Instead of me saying, use orange and pink, I'm going to help you identify the actual brightness levels you're seeing. Then we'll use this chart to figure out which colors match those brightness levels. You're not guessing anymore. You're being systematic." Iris looked at the materials skeptically, but picked up one of the gray value cards and held it up next to the real sunset visible through the window. "The sky is about a level 3 gray," she said, comparing the card to what she saw. I checked the reference chart and confirmed that level 3 gray in a sky context corresponded to orange. "So you'd use cadmium orange or a similar warm light color," I explained. "Not because you're seeing orange, but because you understand that level 3 gray in the sky at sunset translates to orange in color vocabulary. We worked through the entire sunset that way, Iris identifying gray values and me helping her translate them into color choices using the chart. The process was slower and more analytical than our previous intuitive approach, but the painting she created was actually more accurate than anything she'd done before. When we finished and compared it to the real sunset, the colors matched in a way they never had previously. Iris stared at both paintings, hers and mine, side by side, and for the first time since the diagnosis, I saw something like hope in her expression. "So I can still paint," she said slowly. just differently than I thought I was doing it before. I nodded and explained that she'd actually been doing something even more impressive than typical painting. Most people paint by copying what they see. You're painting by understanding a system of relationships between values and colors. That takes more thinking and knowledge than just matching what's in front of you. Iris considered this and picked up the gray value cards again, studying them with new interest. "Can we try again tomorrow?" she asked, and I felt relief wash over me. Our painting routine was back, but transformed into something more honest about what we were each actually perceiving. Over the next few months, Iris threw herself into learning color theory with an intensity that surprised me. She checked out library books about color systems and light wavelengths, learning the science behind why different colors appeared as different gray tones. She practiced using the gray value cards constantly, holding them up to everything she encountered and identifying the exact brightness level. She memorized the reference chart so thoroughly that she could translate values to colors automatically without needing to look anything up. Her paintings evolved to reflect this new systematic approach, becoming more technically accurate even as they maintained the emotional quality that had always made her work special. The art teacher, Mrs. Kellerman, noticed the improvement and asked what had changed, and Iris proudly explained her new method of working with gray values instead of trying to perceive colors directly. Mrs. Kellerman was fascinated and asked if Iris would be willing to demonstrate her technique for the class, and I watched my daughter teach her color-sighted peers about value relationships and why they mattered more than hue for creating depth and dimension. The other students were confused at first, not understanding why anyone would work with gray values when they could see colors directly, but Iris patiently explained that understanding values was what made good painting possible. "Color is just decoration," she said with confidence that surprised me. "Value is structure. If you get the values right, the colors almost don't matter." It was something I'd read in one of the color theory books, but hearing Iris articulate it showed how deeply she'd internalized this new way of thinking about art. When Iris turned 8, she asked if we could enter some of her paintings in a regional student art competition. I was nervous because I didn't know how judges would respond to work created by someone with achromatopsia, but Iris insisted she wanted to try. We selected 3 of her recent sunsets, painted using the value-based method, and submitted them with an artist's statement where Iris explained her condition and her technique. The judging was blind, meaning judges didn't know anything about the artists beyond what was in the statements, and I tried to prepare Iris for possible rejection. But when the results were announced, Iris had won 2nd place in her age category, and the judges' comments praised her exceptional understanding of value relationships and sophisticated use of color harmony. At the awards ceremony, one of the judges approached us and said she'd been skeptical reading Iris's statement about being completely colorblind, but the paintings themselves were so technically sound that she had to accept the truth of it. "Your daughter has taught herself something that art students in college struggle with," the judge said. "She understands that successful painting is about structure and relationships, not just copying local color. That's a remarkably mature approach for someone so young." The recognition gave Iris confidence to continue pushing her skills further. She started experimenting with subjects beyond sunsets, painting portraits where she captured emotional depth through value contrasts, landscapes where she conveyed atmosphere through careful gradations of light and dark. The fact that she couldn't see color became almost irrelevant to the quality of her work because she'd mastered the underlying principles that made visual art successful. By age 9, her paintings were winning competitions regularly, and galleries started expressing interest in showing her work. One curator from a contemporary art space downtown contacted me after seeing Iris's paintings in a group show, saying she wanted to feature Iris in a solo exhibition. I was hesitant about putting that kind of pressure on a 9-year-old, but the curator assured me it would be low pressure and educational, a chance to teach people about how colorblind artists work. Iris was excited by the opportunity, so we accepted. The exhibition was titled Value and Vision, Paintings by Iris Cross, and it opened on a Saturday afternoon when Iris was 9.5. We displayed 15 of her paintings, including some from before the diagnosis alongside recent work, letting viewers see the evolution of her technique. Iris also created an interactive display where people could try using gray value cards to identify colors, experiencing a simplified version of what she did every time she painted. At the opening reception, Iris gave a short talk about her experience learning she was colorblind and developing a new approach to art. She spoke clearly and confidently, explaining that her achromatopsia wasn't a disability, but a different way of perceiving that required different techniques. "I see the world in gray," she said, "but I understand colors as a system of relationships. I know that orange is brighter than purple, that yellow is the lightest color, and dark blue is one of the darkest. I know which colors go together to make new colors, and I know which combinations create harmony or contrast. I can't see the colors themselves, but I don't need to, because I understand how they work." The audience was captivated, and several people came up after to ask detailed questions about her process. One woman introduced herself as Dr. Sophie Hammond from the university's Vision Research Department, saying she'd been studying colorblind artists for years, but had never encountered a child who'd developed such sophisticated strategies at such a young age. She asked if she could interview Iris for a research paper, and after discussing it with me, Iris agreed. The interviews happened over several weeks, with Dr. Hammond asking detailed questions about how Iris had learned to translate gray values into colors, how she identified colors in contexts where she couldn't use her reference charts, how she knew whether her color choices were successful. Iris explained her entire mental framework, and Dr. Hammond recorded everything with obvious excitement. The resulting research paper was published in a journal about visual perception and art, with Iris's paintings included as examples. The paper's argument was that color perception wasn't necessary for color creation, that understanding systematic relationships between colors was more important than subjectively experiencing their qualities. The attention was overwhelming at first, with media outlets wanting to interview Iris about being a colorblind artist. We did a few local news segments where Iris demonstrated her painting technique and talked about seeing in grayscale, but I was careful not to let it become exploitative. Iris was still a kid who needed normal childhood experiences, not just a novelty act for people curious about disability. Her school was supportive, with teachers incorporating discussions about different types of perception into their lessons, helping classmates understand that people could experience the same reality in fundamentally different ways. Iris made friends with other kids who had various disabilities, forming a group that advocated for accessibility and understanding. She started speaking at schools about her experience, teaching younger kids that differences in how people perceived or processed the world didn't make anyone less capable, just required different approaches to the same tasks. Our evening painting sessions continued through Iris's elementary and middle school years, evolving as she grew more skilled and independent. By age 11, she didn't need my guidance anymore. She could analyze a scene, identify the value relationships, and translate them into appropriate colors all on her own. But we still painted together most evenings, because the ritual had never really been about technique. It had been about connection. Those hours were when we talked about school drama and friend issues and her dreams for the future, when we processed the normal challenges of growing up through the meditative rhythm of brush on canvas. Sometimes we'd work on independent projects in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's presence. Other times we'd collaborate on large pieces, combining our different ways of seeing into single paintings that somehow incorporated both color and value-based approaches. Those collaborative works were my favorites, because they represented our relationship honestly, two people experiencing the world differently, but creating something beautiful together. When Iris turned 13, she made a decision that surprised me. She wanted to create an exhibition specifically exploring her experience of colorblindness, not hiding it or overcoming it, but examining what it meant to navigate a colorful world in grayscale. She'd been painting for 9 years at that point, and felt ready to do something more conceptually ambitious. She started creating diptychs, where one painting showed a scene in accurate colors, and the other showed the same scene in the grayscale values she actually perceived. The paired images were striking, forcing viewers to see how much visual information could be conveyed through value alone, while also highlighting what was lost without hue perception. She also created a series of abstract paintings based entirely on value patterns, demonstrating that color wasn't necessary for visual interest or emotional impact. In her artist's statement for the exhibition, Iris wrote that she wanted people to understand that her vision wasn't broken or inferior, just different, and that difference had taught her to understand art in ways that might actually be more fundamental than typical color sight. The exhibition was titled Seeing Gray, and it opened at the same contemporary art space that had shown her first solo show 4 years earlier. Critics praised it as surprisingly sophisticated work from such a young artist, and several pieces were acquired by museums interested in art about disability and perception. One reviewer wrote that Iris had transformed a supposed limitation into a rigorous artistic inquiry that challenges viewers to reconsider their assumptions about vision and value. Reading that review made me emotional because it validated everything Iris had worked toward, acknowledging that her approach to art wasn't just compensating for a disability, but exploring legitimate questions about perception and representation. The exhibition traveled to 2 other cities, and Iris gave artist talks at each venue, becoming more confident and articulate with each presentation. She'd found her voice not just as an artist, but as an advocate for understanding different types of perception as equally valid ways of experiencing reality. Now Iris is 15, and we still paint together several times a week, though our sessions have evolved considerably from those early days of copying sunsets through the dining room window. Sometimes we work on independent pieces, Iris pursuing increasingly ambitious projects, while I dabble with techniques I'm learning from online tutorials. Other times we collaborate on commissions, because Iris's work has become sought after by collectors interested in art created through unusual perceptual frameworks. She's thinking about art school for college, considering programs that would let her continue developing her systematic approach to color while also exploring other media. Whatever path she chooses, I know she'll approach it with the same analytical rigor and creative courage she's brought to everything since that devastating diagnosis 7 years ago. That day in Dr. Leeds' office felt like the end of our painting relationship, the revelation that destroyed 3 years of what I'd thought we were sharing. But it turned out to be a beginning instead. the start of a more honest and ultimately richer way of creating art together. Looking back at those first 3 years before we knew about Iris's achromatopsia, I don't see them as wasted time or misguided teaching anymore. Those years of painting sunsets together gave Iris the foundation she needed to develop her sophisticated understanding of color relationships. If I'd known from the start that she couldn't see colors, I might have approached teaching her differently in ways that would have been less effective. Instead, by treating her as a typical color-sighted student, I accidentally helped her build an intuitive understanding of color that she could later translate into her own systematic framework. She'd learned that sunsets involved certain combinations of colors, that clouds needed highlights and shadows to look three-dimensional, that atmospheric perspective required subtle value shifts. When she discovered she'd been working in grayscale all along, she had years of painting experience to draw on, making the transition to value-based methodology much easier than starting from scratch would have been. The paintings from those early years still hang in our house, browns and grays that I once thought were oranges and pinks, muddy greens that I'd believed were purples. They're reminders of how two people can experience the same moment completely differently while still creating something meaningful together. When Iris looks at those old paintings now, she sees them the same way she always has, as accurate representations of the sunsets she was perceiving. When I look at them, I see evidence of how wrong color can be and how right value can be simultaneously. They're not failed attempts at typical sunset paintings. They're successful representations of how Iris sees the world, and understanding that difference has taught me more about art and perception than any class could have. Our painting sessions were never really about the colors anyway. They were about showing up for each other every evening, about creating space for connection and creativity, about building a ritual that could hold us both through grief and discovery and growth. Last week, Iris came home from school excited about an assignment her art teacher had given. Students were supposed to create a painting that represented their personal relationship with color, and Iris had decided to paint our dining room during one of our evening sessions. She set up her canvas and worked for 3 hours, occasionally asking me to check specific value relationships, but mostly working independently. When she finally showed me the finished piece, I was moved nearly to tears. She'd painted me at the table mixing paints on a palette, the colors vibrant and accurate, oranges and pinks and purples, and she'd painted herself sitting across from me, her canvas and palette rendered entirely in grayscale, even though the rest of the painting was colorful. Between us on the table, she'd painted her gray value cards and color reference charts, the tools that bridged our different ways of seeing. The painting was titled Translation, and her artist's statement explained that this was what our painting sessions actually looked like, two people experiencing the same moment in completely different visual realities but using systematic translation to create shared meaning. I asked Iris if she ever wished she could see colors the way I do, and she thought about it carefully before answering. "Sometimes I'm curious what it's like," she said slowly, "but I think if I suddenly could see colors, I'd lose something important about how I understand art. Working around my achromatopsia forced me to really learn color theory and value relationships, to understand painting at a deeper level than just copying what I see. If that changed, I might not paint the same way anymore." Her answer showed remarkable self-acceptance for a 15-year-old, an understanding that her difference wasn't a deficit, but a unique perspective that shaped her work in valuable ways. I told her that learning about her achromatopsia had changed how I understood art, too, that she'd taught me to see beyond surface color to the underlying structure that made images actually work. We'd both grown through the process of adapting our painting practice to accommodate her vision, and the art we created together now was richer for that growth. 3 years ago, getting that email from Mrs. Kellerman felt like discovering a terrible truth that would destroy something precious. But the truth didn't destroy our painting ritual. It transformed it into something more honest and ultimately more meaningful. Iris didn't stop being talented when we learned she was colorblind. She just developed new techniques for expressing that talent in ways that worked with her perception rather than against it. And I didn't stop being her teacher. I just learned to teach in a language we could both understand. Our evening painting sessions are still sacred time, still the hour each day when the world narrows to just us and our canvases, and the quiet satisfaction of making something together. The colors Iris uses are more accurate now, but what matters most hasn't changed. We're still showing up for each other, still creating beauty out of grief and challenge, still building connection through shared creative practice. I taught my daughter to paint sunsets for 3 years before learning she was completely colorblind and discovering that truth was the best thing that ever happened to both of us. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.